Hello, welcome to the second week of Race, Ethnicity, and Crime. I'm going to share my screen, and this is going to be part one of the lecture, which will be about media, race, and crime. I'll post the PowerPoint slides online along with the recorded lecture, and I will also email you the recordings and I will email you the PowerPoint slides as well. So the media often shapes our perception of crime and who is most likely to commit crime and why. The media also shapes public perceptions of innocence and who is most likely to be morally innocent, and who can prevent or stop crime. So the reading this week discusses the relationship between race and criminology. And the reading offers a survey of some of the ways that critical race scholars have intervened into the discipline of criminology. As race scholars and criminologists, we are attuned to Du Bois's still meaningful injunction to oppose this national racket of railroading to jails and chain gangs, to the poor, the friendless, and the Black. So W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the most impressive scholars in the study of race in North America. And Du Bois wrote about the double consciousness that people often have when they're racialized. So Du Bois argued that people often have two senses of consciousness when they have been racialized. And he was particularly interested in Black American identity and the ways that Black Americans see themselves as opposed to the ways that they are seen or constructed by others, and particularly by white Americans. And Du Bois argued that this kind of double consciousness allows one to exist in different times and different spaces and different mental spaces, in the sense that one can understand who they are, but they can also understand who they are in someone else's imaginary, even though this imagination of a Black person might not correspond to reality. A good example is class. There are many people who see people of color and assume that all people of color are of a certain class position, and that all people of color are poor or working class. And if one is aware of their own life and their own financial situation, then this kind of fantasy obviously does not correspond with reality. So this kind of dual consciousness is a way in which racialized subjects navigate the world. In this passage, Du Bois argues that it is often the poor, the friendless, and the Black that are railroaded to jails and chain gangs. The term school to prison pipeline is something that critical race scholars have discussed in detail. So the term is used to make reference to the ways that the school system often suspends certain students and fails them, enacts forms of harsh disciplinary power against people of color, which then leads to the criminal justice system. The use of the educational system to deport people who are non-status migrants is also something that is possible because of the relationship between the academic industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. Our sense that race and crime, write the authors, is neither a new or unexplored area. Already too much scholarship being done in criminology is done with the tacit understanding that although I don't mention the issue of race explicitly, it is, of course, a factor, and racism has been shown to be so deeply rooted in the criminal justice system that further study produces somewhat of a numbing effect. So the criminal justice system has been in the media for several years due to the activism of Black Lives Matter and the use of the criminal justice system to kill people of color and to specifically incarcerate young people of color has been well documented. The desire to criminalize or punish others is obviously about the class structure and the refusal to compete fairly in any area of education or work, to obtain housing. Um, the desire to criminalize others is also about a refusal to take responsibility. After the Holocaust, many theories of responsibility emerged, and people throughout the world were called upon to take responsibility for their negligence and participation in Nazism for their own financial purposes and their own egoism. So, criminology is not alone among the social sciences in being subject to renewed scrutiny in relation to race and racism. And we have drawn from this increasingly energetic and urgent critical literature, most notably from Emmer Baer and Desmond's systematic theoretical framework. This provides our racially mixed research team. And the article this week is written by a team of researchers who are all critical race scholars who are interested in criminology. And so these scholars have use the conceptual tools to identify institutional foundations of whiteness in criminology through its banal, mundane manifestations in our everyday scholarship. Theoretical paradigms and grand narratives, criminology's habits of thought, are castigated for their carelessness in turning away from race and its effects in the UK. So Marxist perspectives regarding race would argue that this kind of banality of whiteness is really about trying to secure certain jobs for white people, maybe specifically white men and a few token women as well, so that people can have these jobs and go to an office and enjoy their salary. And so, what Marxists would argue is that these kind of banal ways of promoting one's friends or partners, and also ways of being extremely rude to others or of gossiping, are just ways of maintaining the class structure and ways of securing employment and housing, and social contacts for oneself to the exclusion of others. However, what's interesting is to think about how capitalists approach the question of race. The liberal arts and humanities, since the time of the Frankfurt School, has really been focused on Marxism as a set of ideas. And so after the Holocaust, the liberal arts and humanities was really formed by many Jewish intellectuals who are in exile, like Karl Marx, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and they were really interested in the ways that capitalism was connected to fascism. That in order to be rich and to secure housing, people do have the capacity to kill others. However, one could also think in this time period that when people are racist, this is actually a refusal to allow capitalism to work properly. So that if capitalism worked properly through machines and everyone was to submit their curriculum vitae online with the number of articles they've published or the number of degrees they have or the number of years of experience, then the results would perhaps be fair. However, when people have to network or when they use informal networks like friend circles or families to get jobs, then the results will perhaps not be fair. So Philip's call is to explicate the dynamic functionality of race, racialization, and racism in post-colonial times within the study of crime and criminal justice, the practice of criminology in the wider academy in the UK. This epistemological challenge can be met, they maintain, by narrating contemporary racialization and racism in historical context, integrating biography, sociology, literary scholarship, and political activism, going beyond the disembodied quantification of positivist empiricism, instead humanizing the racialized pains of criminal justice by explicitly addressing the specificities of their racial dynamics. So epistemology refers to the study of knowledge, and one of the problems in proving racial discrimination, say in labor law or in employment disputes or in housing disputes, is the proof. How do you prove that people are racist? And many people who are racist in this time period will mask their disdain for others or will mask their desire to create hierarchy because of skin color or religion or nationality. So narration is one of the ways that knowledge production works in the field of critical race studies, that narrating events and narrating certain scenes and how people behave in those scenes must be placed in historical context, integrating biography, sociology, literary scholarship, and political activism, going beyond the disembodied quantification of positivist empiricism. So if I was to narrate my journey to the university, I would state that it exists obviously in historical context. So London, England is a city that I lived in quite happily. And the Prime Minister of London, England, is now Keith Stammer, I believe his name is, but it was Rishi Sunak was the previous prime minister, and he is a fiscal conservative, and he is married to a woman named Akshata Murthy, who is a very, very wealthy Indian woman. It isn't really surprising for people in the city of London to see a middle class Indian woman wearing a coat from Zara and makeup. However, when you travel in settler Canada, there's something about seeing adult women, and maybe particularly non-white women who are middle class and who look at all middle class, that I guess is somehow surprising for the Canadian public. And they need to react in a lot of different ways. Zara is not really a store that would be considered a high-end store for many people, and makeup isn't really that expensive. So obviously, settler colonialism is not just about money. It is about Canadian culture, but also about hierarchies of gender and race, and the ways that women are supposed to present in public. Um, I would argue that the impoverishment of women and the use of colonial domesticity and virtues of niceness and friendliness and helpfulness have really shaped the ways that people think of women, and maybe specifically women of color who are imagined to belong to immigrant communities. It is really interesting to think about the ways that self-presentation in public for people would change over time and space in different cities. New York City is obviously only 1 hour away from the city of Toronto. So the ways that people imagine someone in public space, or what they think of as being out of place or remarkable, would obviously change if one was to travel elsewhere. So the work of race can always be thought of in relation to the specific historical context, and also personal biography, and also sociology, the class dynamics of a society. So one could think about class in Ontario and the ways that ideas of race are always shaped by class antagonism. So, conscious criminology is discussed by your authors, or by the authors from this week's readings. So, Phillips et al. And et al. Is used as, it's an academic term. So when you're reading or writing academic scholarship, et al. Is used to refer to a group of researchers. So Phillips et al. Conduct an exercise in institutional reflexivity by excavating British criminology's production of racial knowledge and the hidden presuppositions that shape it. Criminology is not alone among the social sciences in being subject to renewed scrutiny in relation to race and racism, and we have drawn from this increasingly energetic and urgent critical literature, most notably from Emmer Baer and Desmond's systematic theoretical framework. This provides our racially mixed team with the conceptual tools to identify the institutional foundations of whiteness in criminology. So, whiteness in its most mundane and banal form can even involve trying to tell people what to wear. Um, Angela McRobbie is a British sociologist, and she has written about the ways that the British middle class often ridicule the British working class. And she wrote an article called Notes on What not to wear. And she makes reference to these shows about making fun of or mocking working class women, and the majority of whom are working class white British women, and telling them what not to wear. So Trini and Susanna are these very haughty middle class British women who tell people that they look awful and tell them why on these shows. So, if we were to come to whiteness and its banality, ideas of who can and cannot wear things are central to whiteness and perhaps to white femininity. Um, whether it is Trinity and Susanna or it is white working class women who do not want people to wear middle class clothing. So, this is one of the banal ways that whiteness operates. Unfortunately, if this takes place in a workplace, then it leads us to labor law and to discrimination law. So, I would also argue that one could again narrativize these scenes of telling women of color what to wear or what not to wear, in relation to history. So when my mother immigrated to Canada, she wore a sari and she was told not to wear this sari by different white Canadians, some of whom thought that it was an emblem of being poor, some of whom said that it was too fancy. Obviously, this kind of banal whiteness is just about being a racist. The same has been true of Black women's hair throughout the whole history of North America. When you are a racist, you look at people of color as if it is your place to judge people of color, and specifically the bodies of people of color. You also think that people of color work for you. The work for you can extend to live for you. So not only does someone work for you, they live their life for you. So they get dressed up for you, they eat for you, they live their lives for you. When taken to extreme and yes, insane proportions, we get to the murder of George Floyd and the killing of Black people. And yes, the extrajudicial killing of many Black people, which has led to the movement Black Lives Matter. George Perry Floyd Jr. was an African American man who was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, during an arrest made after a store clerk suspected Floyd might have used a counterfeit $20 bill on May 25th, 2020. Derek Chauvin, one of four police officers who arrived on the scene, knelt on Floyd's neck and back for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, fatally sorry, asphyxiating him. After his murder, a series of protests against police brutality, especially towards Black people, quickly spread across the United States and globally. His dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying slogan. So even in the Wikipedia entry for George Perry Floyd Jr., I am not at all satisfied with it. I'm not at all satisfied with anything that North Americans ever write about race. I'm not really satisfied with the vast majority of white people and their behavior and their attitudes towards race. The fact that this is mentioned, so during an arrest made after a store clerk suspected Floyd might have used a counterfeit $20 bill. So even after he is dead, George Floyd is still on trial for using a counterfeit $20 bill at a store. So then we get back to this: poor people, poor white people, and poor working class white people. If I was to go to a really rich store and I was to buy something, the person working there would probably not even care. They would just take the money because they would have a life. I have lived in London, England before, and I've used credit cards and no one cares. It wouldn't matter if it took me 5 credit cards and on the sixth try, I could finally buy something. No one would care because middle class people and rich people often have a life. Working class people are consistently racist and annoying to people of color. Working class people throughout North America have often consistently decided to become the police. This is why teachers are police. This is why police officers decide to kill someone. This is why store clerks are police. Many people would argue that the Marxist tradition has consistently tried to rescue the working class from any sense of responsibility. I have read the Marxist tradition, and I am not at all convinced that white working class people deserve lots of sympathy and solidarity. So, Stuart Hall was a Black British Marxist scholar. And Stuart Hall wrote extensively about media and race. So I guess in terms of the Marxist tradition, it was really popular, and I guess it's still popular. I would argue that it's popular because it allows white middle class men to pretend to be working class or to constantly discuss white working class men who they've never met and don't really know, who meet people like George Floyd and call the police. But I would argue that it is about a complete lack of responsibility. The Marxist tradition began with German Jewish intellectuals, and it began because of responsibility after the Holocaust. Any theories of responsibility can quickly move towards being used in irresponsible ways to support one's own interest and to refuse to look at other important forms of scholarship in this period, like queer theory and feminist theory and critical race theory. The use of class to constantly make sense of things that are actually about race or about sexism or about heterosexism has been consistent in the liberal arts and humanities. And I'm not really convinced that Marxism is the best antidote to racism. George Floyd having a counterfeit $20 bill is about someone not doing their job. If you work at a store and someone has a counterfeit $20 bill or you suspect them of having this counterfeit money, you can just decide to not take their money. I suppose many people would just do their jobs and take the money and want capitalism to go on. I would argue that white working class people are often extremely racist because they refuse to allow to participate in capitalism fairly. Because if we were to all participate in capitalism fairly, like making online orders instead of ever buying things in public, then things would be fair. So Stuart Hall was, however, a Marxist. He is dead. He died in 2014. So Stuart Henry MacPhail Hall was a Jamaican-born British Marxist sociologist, cultural theorist, and political activist. Hall, along with Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams, was one of the founding figures of the school of thought known as British Cultural Studies or the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. So Hull was a really influential thinker, and he was a Marxist, and he was interested in the ways that media shapes our ideas of race. So media can shape our perceptions of crime, and uh, I did unfortunately grow up in this rural town in Ontario, which I have never visited again, and I will never visit again. And I have not kept in touch with a single person who lives in this town. And I would hide if I saw anyone from the town. People did watch an extensive amount of television. Uh, there were consistent patterns of viewing that involved watching extreme stereotypes, extreme representations of Black Americans. And all of the representations of Black Americans involved an obsession with money. There were shows like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which was about this really affluent Black family, and they ran in sequence with shows that were also about gang activity featuring young Black people. So I did live in this awful town with these people who watched so much television. There were times when people would say really, really offensive things to me, and it was obviously from television. Um, I don't think that people were really literate or at all interested in the world or interested in accurate information whatsoever. So this is a clip about Stuart Hall.
When I was about 19 or 20, Miles Davis put his finger on my soul. The various moods of Miles Davis matched the evolution of my own feelings. There continued to be a regret for the loss of a life which I might have lived but didn't live.
As we slide out of the 1980s, who's going to define the cultural themes of the next 10 years? No one on the British left thinks harder about this question than Stuart Hall.
Tell me why have they all come to this country?
It's not long ago you were bombing Kosovo. Now, this is the long-term result of that situation. But I don't know how you could describe the people as bogus.
Accommodation and adjustment between blacks and whites is on the agenda.
When I ask anybody where they're from, I expect nowadays to be told an extremely long story. But I think identity is an endless, ever unfinished conversation. Always supposed really something would give us a definition of who we really were, our class position or our national position or our geographic origins or where our grandparents came from. And I don't think any one thing any longer will tell us who we are.
So the media has shaped our perceptions of race. Cindy Gladue was an Indigenous woman who was murdered. Cindy Ivy Gladue, 36, was a mother of 3 children. On June 22nd, 2011, she was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room. She had bled to death from an 11-centimeter wound to her vagina. On March 18th, 2015, a jury found Bradley Barton not guilty of first-degree murder. In June 2017, the Alberta Court of Appeal has overturned Barton's acquittal and ordered a new trial. So this photo ran in the Canadian press after Cindy Gladue was murdered. There are many photos that could have been used of Cindy Gladue with her children or smiling, or I don't know. I suppose if I died, I wouldn't really want this to be the photo that was used in the press. However, we can come back to the law, and we can come back to class antagonism, and we can come back to my suspicions about the white working class and why I don't think that Marxism has ever worked or will work in this life or the next. It is not against the law in Canada to smoke. If George Floyd did have a counterfeit $20 bill, I guess it's not against the law for him to try to use it. I could try to give someone, I don't know, the Indian National Rupee, and maybe they could take a trip and find some meaning in their life. But they don't have to take the Indian National Rupee. If I was to actually go to a store with the Indian National Rupee and try to pay for something, the person could obviously say no, but if they called the police, would I then be asphyxiated to death? I don't think that that is the law. Cindy Gladue could smoke. I mean, how much money does the Canadian government make from smoking? How much money did the American government make from slavery? So then we get back to my suspicions about Marxism. Marxism would only make sense as a set of ideas if white working class people, including white working class women, including white working class gay people, would actually be working class and would not consistently try to find ways to pathologize people of color and indigenous people. Um, there is no form of class solidarity that I have ever seen in my entire life from white working class people. White working class people are constantly trying to become middle class or pretend to be the middle class. So I think that it would perhaps be better if we thought about capitalism. These uses of photos and the constant mention that Gladue was a mother and had children are not really about advanced capitalism. If someone came to this city for some reason from Paris and they wanted to smoke, I guess they could, and they probably could afford it with the euro. So the larger canvas in Hall's work configures nation-state citizen relations, wherein, despite official rhetoric of multiculturalism, equal protection for post-colonial citizens amid the nostalgia for empire is still never assured. As Murgy muses in drawing from Hall and echoing our aim in this special section, it is always about race, but never just race in a narrow sense. So, what I would argue from a feminist perspective is that race is always gendered and sexualized. There is no existence of race that is also not about a certain ideal of masculinity and also femininity. So George Floyd having counterfeit money is an affront to this idea of American masculinity. As mentioned in previous lectures, abortion has been banned in many states throughout the United States of America. So this idea of North American masculinity involves money and power, that men should always have a lot of money, they should be rich, they should never have financial problems, and they should support women. And these women whom they should support should never smoke, they shouldn't drink, they should be good domestic housewives. So these ideas of race are also about who fails to live up to certain cisgender heteronormative Christian ideals of masculinity and also femininity. The study of disability and disability studies is one of the most interesting fields of scholarship in our time. And I think it really surpasses uh, a lot of other disciplines in our time. Queer theory and feminist theory often seem repetitive, and critical race theory always comes back to this endless question about Marxism and capitalism. But disability studies asks to think about our obsession with perfection in others and how at any time people can just decide to stigmatize or police or even kill others because of some imagined imperfection. So the media ran this photo, and I believe, I mean, the underlying message in running this photo after Cindy Gladue died is for us to see her as someone who, I guess, made mistakes and is not deserving of sympathy. Many people are not perfectly healthy. I would argue that no person who considers themselves to be able-bodied is perfectly healthy. That does not really exist. The human body changes as we age. People could slip and fall. People can have different uh, mood swings or mental health issues or disturbances or depression throughout the whole course of their lives. So disability studies is also about questioning the ways that ableism allows people who see themselves as able-bodied to stigmatize others. The same is true of George Floyd. There are times in life where people might not have the capacity to work all the time. They might have problems with money. And this kind of survival of the fittest takes us back to Darwinism and Nazism. The idea that only the strong survive is a philosophy that was popular among the Nazis. So Stuart Hall's work was also interested in the ways that contemporary media depictions of race are always connected to histories of colonialism. And Anne McClintock wrote this book called Imperial Leather. And in the book, McClintock discusses the ways that consumer capitalism and advertising was central to colonial history. So these ads were used by Pears Soap in the 19th century. And Pears Soap promoted cleanliness as a virtue throughout the British Empire by showing soap as a way that colonized people could become clean. And there was an association in the advertising and also in British colonial writing between skin color and human filth. This is why the great colonial missions, which were about stealing large sums of money, jewels, and impoverishing and enslaving people, were often referred to as civilizing missions, washing the great unwashed of the world. So, if we think about this civilizing mission, we can think about the ways that the Canadian media is constantly involved in this morality play with Indigenous peoples, which obviously masks the overarching interests of colonialism, which are economic. And I would argue that colonialism is first and foremost about theft and about greed. So Stuart Hall's theories of representation ask us to consider the ways that images and words signify. And Hall was interested in the ways that media participates in ideology. So ideology is a Marxist concept. We do not know what we are doing, but we are still doing it. And Marxists argue that we are all participating in capitalist ideology and we are unaware of it. And so Hall went on to discuss the ways that media participates in class exploitation. So ideas are central to Marx and Engels' writing in the German ideology. And while Marx was interested in class antagonism in terms of work and labor exploitation, what Marx also argued is that the ruling class will also determine the ruling ideas of our time. Although Marx portrayed capitalism as a system of class exploitation and oppression operating through the ownership of the means of production, he also acknowledged the power of ideas, values, and beliefs. As Marx and Engels put it in the German ideology, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time the ruling intellectual force. In Marx's view, ideas and culture are part of a superstructure that is conditioned or determined by the economic base, the mode of production. So the superstructure then controls the mode of production, the economic base through which things are made. So the ruling ideas of our time will then control the economy. So the kind of obsession that Canadians have with, say, cottages or going out and actually like marveling at all the land that they have stolen from the Indigenous people and all the empty land that they've cleared out by murdering people will create this kind of cottage industry and these towns with all these fields that you can look at and think, all these people are not here anymore. And I guess let's celebrate. So these ideas of the ruling class have provided Marxism with two theories of culture. The first suggests that culture is essentially class specific. As members of a class share the same experience and have a common economic position and interests, they are likely to have broadly similar ideas, values, and beliefs. In Marx's words, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. Proletarian culture and ideas can therefore be expected to differ markedly from bourgeois ones. The second theory of culture emphasizes the degree to which the ideas of the ruling class, what Marx referred to as ideology, pervade society and become the ruling ideas of the age. In this view, political culture, even civic culture, is nothing more than bourgeois ideology. What is important about this view is that it sees culture, values, and beliefs as a form of power. From the Marxist perspective, the function of ideology is to reconcile subordinate classes to their exploitation and oppression by propagating myths, delusions, and falsehoods. In Engels' word, false consciousness. Later, Marxists have understood this process in terms of bourgeois hegemony. So, this idea of class consciousness is really about the proletariat and the proletariat trying to construct a culture or a sense of identity that is different from the bourgeoisie. I would argue that whiteness operates by always aligning the white working class with the sensibilities of the white bourgeoisie, irrespective of their class interests or their actual class position. The school system is a great example that even if one is working class, they are constantly trying to orient themselves towards being the middle class by using the school system. The same is true of an obsession with certain industries, which might be really costly and uh, extremely difficult for working class people to be involved in or maintain. The same is true of friendship that many people might try throughout the whole course of their bloody lives to try to maintain relationships with middle class people, even if they are working class. So hegemony is the next point. Hegemony is, in its simplest sense, the ascendancy or domination of one element of a system over others. In Marx's theory, the term is used in a more specific sense. In the writings of Gramsci, hegemony refers to the ability of a dominant class to exercise power by winning the consent of those it subjugates as an alternative to the use of coercion. As a non-coercive form of class rule, hegemony typically operates through the dissemination of bourgeois values and beliefs throughout society. So hegemony is a set of dominant views, and one of these dominant views it is about the power that the dominant class has to exercise power by winning consent of those it subjugates. So this consent can be about labor exploitation, that people have to consent to being friends and pretending to be part of a community. The root of the word community is communal. So if you're paid much, much less than certain people, then why do you have to be part of a community? I would argue again, though, that capitalism in its pure form does not necessarily need this kind of banal form of whiteness where we all have to pretend to be friends. If there was not the existence of money, would we even talk to each other? My answer would perhaps be no. Modern Marxists have been quick to acknowledge that in no sense do the ruling ideas of the bourgeoisie monopolize intellectual and cultural life in a capitalist society, excluding all rival views. Yes, but the rival views are often heavily policed. The use of the police to try to make people either happy or dead is a central part of the North American middle class. The Canadian middle class and their obsession with niceness is for a part of ruling ideology. And yes, there are rival views. People don't have to be nice to get paid. Someone doesn't get a PhD in being nice or being, yes, a housewife, a servant, someone's friend. It is kind of this endless banal whiteness which casts characters in gendered and racial terms. So Stuart Hall draws on Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was the most influential 20th century exponent of this view of hegemony. And Gramsci was interested in the ways that the class system is upheld, not simply by unequal economic and political power, but also by bourgeois hegemony. This consists of the spiritual and cultural supremacy of the ruling class brought about through the spread of bourgeois values and beliefs via civil society, the mass media, the churches, youth movements, trade unions, and so forth. So Gramsci was interested in the ways that class, antagonism, and the rule of the bourgeoisie exists in every form and facet of life. It is about the music that people listen to, the clothes that they wear, their attitudes towards life, the tone of speech that they take, which takes us back to Judith Butler and gender performativity. Also about mass media, the forming of the labor unions, all of it is really about this kind of bourgeoisie hegemony and their desire to control revolutionary figures. What makes this process so insidious is that it extends beyond formal learning and education into the very common sense of age. The significance of Gramsci's analysis is that in order for socialism to be achieved, a battle of ideas has to be waged through which proletarian principles, values, and theories displace or at least challenge bourgeois ideas. So political bias is also something that Gramsci discusses in detail. And Gramsci and Stuart Hall are also interested in how the media shape political perception. So the election of Kamala and Debbie Harris to the United States, to the position of Vice President of the United States of America, was not about the election of a vice president in the media. It was about a Black woman and sometimes a Black Indian woman who is the vice president. And Kamala Debbie Harris was already a very wealthy, successful American woman. But much like television, there are these instances where brown and Black women who are not dead or in third world countries appear before the public in the school system, in the media, politics. And it sometimes just causes people to react in really, let's say, interesting ways. So this is a clip about Stuart Hall.
We live in a world saturated with media. We see our reality through them. But these are not transparent operations. They involve the workings of power. Stuart Hall was an outsider, born in colonial Jamaica, educated in Oxford. He was out of place in both. He left academia, the literary canon, high culture, to become an intellectual of mass culture. What he did was controversial. He was looking at the power of mainstream media in representing race, gender, class, ethnicity, religion. Hall said those discourses are not innocent, that hidden in mass media is ideology. The media theory's job is to find that ideology, expose it, critique it. The media's racialization of crime, the patriarchal narratives on gender, the othering of immigrants, Muslims, the poor. The media are active agents in this process. But what of the masses? The audience is watching. Hall broke with the presumption that the masses are dumb, passive. In fact, he questioned who the faceless masses even are. Some may accept the dominant meanings embedded in the media. Some may negotiate them. Others outright reject them. Where other media theorists argue that messages are imposed on people from above, Hall said power is not as simple as that. He saw pockets of resistance that undermine dominant media narratives. Think of the bloggers in Tunisia, the graffiti artists of Brazil. Black Lives Matter. But Hall went further. He also told us to seek out stories elsewhere, in the lowly, despised spaces of knowledge. The gossip mags, the soap opera, the music videos. If you want to understand society, then maybe avoid the news. Those formalized spaces that house official discourse. Find different stories, different perspectives, different realities.
So, a cultural theorist, Stuart Hall, offers an extended meditation on representation. Moving beyond the accuracy or inaccuracy of specific representations, Hall argues that the process of representation itself constitutes the very world it aims to represent and explores how the shared language of a culture, its signs and images, provides a conceptual roadmap that gives meaning to the world rather than simply reflecting it. Hall's concern throughout is the centrality of culture to shaping our collective perceptions and how the dynamics of media representation reproduce forms of symbolic power. So Hall was interested then in how media is shaped by signs and images. Hall drew on the work of French linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and Hall was interested in semiotics, which is the study of signs. So for Hall, a sign is composed, drawing on Ferdinand de Saussure, a sign is composed of the signified and the signifier. So the concept is, say, love, and the signifier is the word love. What is being signified is emotion. So the sign itself is composed of both what is used to signify something, what is being signified, and the sign. So a sign is composed of the idea that you were trying to express and the medium that you were trying to express it in. You could also draw a heart, for example, and it would still be about love, and you would be trying to signify emotion, and you would be using the concept, which is the heart. So Hall then works with these ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure to think about race and the media. So when one is trying to signify crime, do they draw on certain characters in film and in media to represent Black people, and for Hall, Black British people as criminals? And what Hall does is to show how the media consistently casts characters as criminals. And what is being used is the image of a person of color over and over and over again, to the point that it becomes like a drawing of a heart. When you see it, you immediately know what it means and what it is. And Hall argues that the media has this hegemonic effect on our minds, that the media is not just film and television, it is advertising, it is the kind of signs that you see, it is the names on streets. And when you see the same things repeated over and over and over again, they become really familiar, and you understand that you should have a positive feeling when you see the heart, and you should have a negative feeling when you see something else. The bombing of the World Trade Center was the anniversary, September 11th, that people are still writing articles about the bombing of the World Trade Center. So from that time onwards, there was so much media that when you see certain people in media, our perceptions have obviously been shaped by constant repetition. So hegemony then works by repeating certain ideas and tropes about people and about life over and over again across many institutions. So Karl Marx wrote, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The control over ideas and who can produce knowledge and what tone this knowledge takes and what people can say, and yes, freedom of speech are central to class antagonism. So the production of knowledge by people of color, by women of color, by queer people of color, by indigenous peoples is central to class antagonism. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report discusses cultural genocide as being one of the ways that genocide continues. So, one of the reasons that the report argues that genocide of Indigenous women and girls continues in Canada is because of cultural genocide, the refusal to acknowledge Indigenous language, the refusal to acknowledge Indigenous systems of thought or philosophy. So the hegemony of white male intellectuals is obviously about class antagonism. Marx's approach clearly defines ideology as something that is oppressive and can only be escaped through the dialectics of capitalism. The idea of ideology in Marxism, then, doesn't acknowledge or give much credence to the existence of other cultures or ideologies, but the idea of hegemony does. Rather than a single ruling ideology, the idea of hegemony recognizes that there are many possible cultures that vary by time and circumstance. This idea of hegemony allows us to see ideology as active. It opens the door for us to see cultures in conflict vying for position and affluence. So I would argue that hegemonic whiteness is a gendered and sexual project, and white femininity and masculinity as a set of norms and ideals, as a set of rules, and even as a set of morals are something that we are all taught to revere or abide by. And this is the work of hegemony, and it is the work of class antagonism. Canada is a predominantly white settler colony, and the most criminally minded people in Canada historically were the English and French, who did a significant amount of damage in order to steal other people's land. So, this kind of hegemonic knowledge production of white settlers as great people or as people that we should all emulate is obviously about colonial knowledge production. A principal method through which dominant groups elicit the subordinates' cooperation is by co-opting their lived experiences. It works primarily by inserting the subordinate class into the key institutions and structures which support the power and social authority of the dominant order. It is above all these structures and relations that a subordinate class lives its subordination. Through colonizing all people and trying to steal people's lived experiences and place them in books or place them in categories that are managed by the ruling class and by the colonial settler class is part of hegemony and is class antagonism. For Marx, the revolutionary proletariat will only know itself as revolutionary when they can escape the oppression of the ruling class and all of its mundane forms of hegemony, including hegemonic whiteness. So Hall then, as I mentioned, draws on Ferdinand Saussure to discuss the ways that signs create and limit meaning. And Hall also makes reference to Roland Barthes, who is also a French theorist, who explains that cultural signs, symbols, and images can have both denotative and connotative functions. Denotative functions are the direct meaning of a sign. They're the kind of thing you can look up in an ordinary dictionary. Yet cultural signs and images can also have secondary or quantitative meanings. These meanings get attached to the original word and create other wider fields of meaning. At times, these wider fields of meaning can act like myths, creating hidden meanings behind the more apparent. Thus, systems of connotation can link ideological messages to more primary denotative meanings. In cultural oppression, then, the dominant group represents the subjugated in such a way that negative connotative meanings and myths are produced. So, one of the things that is really interesting about Canada is the complete refusal to use the written word. So, when you work in other contexts like London, England, people obviously communicate everything in writing and they aren't obsessed with face to face meetings or discussions in words. I'm not really sure why. I I don't know if it goes back to the time of like treaties when people wouldn't write things down. They would just say like, hey, take these blankets and oh, like, sorry about the smallpox later. But I'm not sure. This kind of um, use of the word, like the spoken word and the face-to-face meeting, I think is really part of settler colonialism. I prefer to communicate using the written word on the internet, and I prefer to use the internet. So I really wonder why face-to-face meetings and language is central to Canadian white settler identity in every facet of life, including in business. One would wonder if someone's voice is supposed to be, I guess, soothing to another person in the way that children are soothed by their colonial parents. Um, I also wonder if the written word scares people because it would involve the law. So Hall sees representation as an act of reconstruction rather than reflection. Almost every image in a technologically advanced society is created for a reason, with some other or larger purpose in mind. There is then the surface appearance or denotative meaning of the image, but there is also a deeper myth-like connotation there as well. So Roland Barthes was the first person to discuss these levels of images, what images denote and also connote. And there is the surface appearance of the image, what an image denotes, and then there's a deeper image, a set of ideas, what the image actually means. So what cultural theorists have argued in our time is that every image that is produced by companies, by iPhone, by Instagram, by the university, by corporations, are always tactical, and there is a larger purpose in mind that obviously involves branding, student recruitment, the recruitment of large sections of people from India or from China to support the educational or the academic industrial complex, the recruitment of women to buy certain products. There is always this greater purpose. One could also look at the media in North America leading up to the Michael Dobbs ruling and think about the ways the media and the obsession with childbirth and families was also about shaping public perception of abortion. So the idea of representation is a way of critically understanding culture that is usually focused on single images. The idea of discourse, however, is generally used to critique larger swaths of culture. A discourse for Hall is a group of statements which provide a language for talking about, a way of representing a particular kind of knowledge about a topic. Discourses are produced through language and practices. They are ways of talking about and acting towards an idea or group of people. One of the most powerful insights concerning discourses is that anyone deploying a discourse must position themselves as if they were the subjects, as if they were the subject of the discourse. So if a discourse is kind of positioned at you or is deployed against or towards you, you must position yourself as a subject. So if you were to think about kind of truth and reconciliation as an idea, the idea of reconciliation is a set of ideas that and group of statements that collects us all as social actors in Canada, and all we must all reconcile, we must all be together, we must all be nice. And so you must position yourself as a subject if you want to be part of this discourse. So meaning and struggle is also central to Hall's understanding of media. So much like Marxist theorists like Gramsci and others, Hall also discusses this idea of meaning and struggle, and Foucault as well, that many of these authors would argue that no meaning is fixed. The reason that Hall is interested in media is that Stuart Hall believes that the meaning of a set of texts is not fixed, that we as readers can interpret media in certain ways. So one of the ways that people can interpret media is because of other sets of ideas. So if one is highly educated, they might look at romantic comedies and think that they're really trite, or the language that the characters use is really kind of ridiculous. If one has been exposed to feminist theory and the feminist movement, then the kind of exaggerated gender roles that appear in cinema might not be really heartfelt or touching. They might just seem rather silly. So conflict over the meaning of a sign or a discourse is most likely to occur during times of problematized meanings. Meanings become problematized through unexpected events, events that break the social frame, when powerful interests are involved, or when a striking ideological conflict becomes apparent. The social struggle may be manifest in two ways: disarticulation and or conflict over the means of signification production. So Hall then argues that reversing stereotypes don't necessarily overturn them. So Hall is interested in the ways that negative stereotypes about Black people and Black British people in the media are often overturned by advancing positive ideas of the Black family specifically. So for every kind of film about drug dealers and gang members, there is a positive representation of a family and a cisgender heterosexual Black family who are also able-bodied, attractive, and thin. And this is kind of an overturning. However, Hall argues that this kind of overturning of these stereotypes does not really change the ways that we think about race in really static terms. So in the previous lecture, I discussed the ways that race is a social construct. There is no actual truth in race. The grouping together of large sections of the world's population under one category, like Asian or South Asian, does not really even make geographical sense. The grouping of people under categories like brown does not even really make any geographical or linguistic sense. It doesn't make sense in terms of class or personal self-identification, but it is the work of race, and it is foundational to the history of colonialism. They categorizing everything and every person, every piece of every flora, every fauna, every human being was central to British colonialism, which is why if you go to the British Library, they have so many archives, book after book after book of every country in the world that the British visited, of every piece of art that they stole, of every plant that they saw, and they have a kind of diary entry about every person and thing that they saw, uh, and every person that they stole from. So this representation, or this substitution of a range of positive images for Black people and Black life for negative images, which continues to dominate popular popular representation. So the second strategy for Hall involves contesting regimes of representation, and it's an attempt to substitute a range of positive images of Black people, Black life, and Black culture for the negative imagery which continues to dominate popular representation. So the idea of correcting the balance does not change the binary opposition. Colonial ideology works through a series of binary oppositions, and Robert Young he wrote about colonialism extensively, and he wrote a book about colonial knowledge where Robert Young discusses the ways that colonialism often worked through a series of oppositions: the colonizer and the colonized, white and Black, free and enslaved. And this kind of division of the world obviously makes no sense in a time of post-colonialism. So people of color throughout the world are not enslaved or under colonial rule. So this kind of positive strategy is also critiqued by theorists who argue that the positive images of families and taking care of children are really counter-revolutionary images that attempt to subdue the political energies and the kind of anger that people feel who are victims of racism. So the third counter strategy locates itself within the complexities and ambivalences of representation itself and tries to contest it from within. It is more concerned with the forms of racial representation than with introducing a new content. It accepts and works with the shifting, unstable character of meaning and enters, as it were, into a struggle over representation while acknowledging that since meaning can never be finally fixed, there can never be any final victories. Thus, instead of avoiding the Black body because it has been so caught up in the complexities of power and subordination within representation, this strategy positively takes the body as the principal site of its representational strategies, attempting to make the stereotypes work against themselves. Instead of avoiding the dangerous terrain opened up by the interweaving of race, gender, and sexuality, it deliberately contests the dominant gendered and sexual definitions of difference by working on Black sexuality. So this third strategy is really important and interesting in our time because of how many queer people of color there are and how many Black feminists there are who are at the forefront of American politics, political and social life, and also cultural production, fashion, music, art. So working against this kind of negative or positive imagery, which itself is already really about a kind of heteronormative capitalist ideal that we are all striving towards, moves us towards working on the complexity of representations of life. So I'll finish by playing this clip of Kara Walker, who is I would argue, one of the most impressive artists of our time. Kara Walker is an American contemporary painter, silhouettist, printmaker, installation artist, filmmaker, and professor who explores race, gender, sexuality, violence, and identity in her work. She is best known for her room-sized tableau of Black cut paper silhouettes. Walker was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship in 1997 at the age of 28, becoming one of the youngest ever recipients of the award. She has been the Tepper Chair in Visual Arts at the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University since 2015. So this is a clip of Carl.
I do drawings in order to be certain that I am here. It's kind of an existential exercise. My name is Kara Walker. I concentrate, I guess, graphically with drawing as the main medium, but my main focus has to do with identity, with the intersections of race, gender, nationality, place, histories, stories, mythologies, jokes, riddles, and paradoxes. So this is an exhibition of my work titled "A Black Hole is Everything a Star Longs to Be." And it's a kind of an excavation of my work from archives, from boxes, and works that I hadn't seen over, I guess, a 28-year period, which sounds absurd, but there are a few drawings in here from at least the very early 90s. The black hole sort of reoccurs in my work in different forms. First, verbally, as you know, the paradoxical whole, which is an emptiness, and a whole with a W, which is a fullness. You know, it has a sexual overtone, obviously, but it's also about this cosmic kind of an existential kind of space. And it's also about blackness, and it's also about blackness in sort of white colonial landscape, a kind of a non-being or a non-entity. The groups of work in themselves constitute a kind of a larger work, and then the exhibition itself is a large work. You know, I just think of it as kind of a work in itself, where you move through these different passages of time, of thought, of humor, and of rage, and of stasis, and of uncertainty, and blend.
So Kara Walker is the proper way you pronounce the artist's name. Kara Walker is a winner of many prizes, a winner of many things. Kara Walker is better than many people in the world. Their artwork is better. Their scholarship is better. Kara Walker is a winner, and therefore we can also think about racism as a discourse of losers.
Or emptiness, silliness, and sometimes all at the same time. I did a series of drawings of Barack Obama, thinking about all of the caricatures and characterizations, mischaracterizations that have abounded in the time of his, ascendancy to the presidency and beyond. The feeling of loss, and also just the feeling of anger that the country that I lived in would take such a hard turn to the right. They're not exactly exact, I just wanted to sort of get it out there, the positive, negative, for some aligned with greatness, others aligned with savagery. The next image is just the hope that's fading in the dark clouds. The next image is the beleaguered saint, and the next is just getting his revenge very nicely, very upstandingly, and with a great deal of sadness. I do sometimes refer to historical events, and I do also sometimes mix that up with stories, narratives, and fictions that permeate culture. I just started to think about all the unknowns that live within the stories that we tell ourselves, where we come from, or who we are. Like in general, the myth making, the kind of like storytelling, the lies, the lies that led to bloodshed, and the sort of persistence of those lies as they kind of seep into the body, as they seep into how you're interacting, how people are interacting with me, and how I recognize myself to be different than what they were seeing. So thinking about history and making art, I had to really kind of take into account, do I want to be a real historian, or do I want to be an amateur historian who has misread or only only read what she wants to read in order that it supports her argument for legitimacy. And I think when you start making art, you're trying to wiggle between everybody's versions of the truth to find this thing that is the most true thing is like, I'm sitting here now doing this line. There's no denying that. So as a woman, as an African American, as an Afro-American woman artist, as an artist, as an amateur historian, as a person who likes to draw, as a person who likes to write, as a person who just is, I think all of the work, especially as we move through it in this exhibition, but also exploring the other work that I've done, like it's the aggregate of it, the it's the whole of it that starts to create. I mean, it's all those interactions happen here, they happen there. It resonates in the in-betweens, it resonates in the spaces, this kind of undulating sort of process of sort of reading and feeling that those aspects of oneself. And I think as a viewer, I mean, I don't know as a viewer what happens exactly. I know as myself what happens, but I would hope that it would open up the sense of those possibilities within oneself to view oneself as a kind of as this kind of clay that is shaped and reshaping.
So, what if we thought about racism as a discourse of losers, and losers who are then consistently trying to find ways to win that often involve theft, that often involve policing people, that often involve criminalizing people? So as time goes on and we can all use the internet and we can all make money and we can all have our own friends and our own lives and our own feelings, the police are now called upon to introduce race into our minds over and over again. So I would argue then, in the interest of time, I'll just finish here. And next week, I'll discuss misogynoir in detail. I would argue that media is central to the production of race. And when one does not feel a certain way about themselves and their life, they can recall certain media images or texts that might make them feel better about themselves. So, romantic film is a good genre where people might feel as though they can see themselves as being people who would fall in love, or uh, beauty culture is like this too, where women might feel as though they're affluent if they look at these advertisements for fashion and they can emulate the ways that uh, affluent women look. And this kind of obsession with the visual and making meaning out of the visual is part of what Peggy Phelan argues are capitalism's relentless appetites for new markets. So, visibility politics for Phelan are compatibility with capitalism's relentless appetite for new markets and with the most self satisfying ideologies of the United States. You are welcome here as long as you are productive. The production and reproduction of visibility are part of the labor of the reproduction of capitalism. This kind of circular argument then leads us back to the debates that I think a lot of critical race scholars and lots of people of color have about capitalism. If capitalism is always going to be unfair, if it is always going to involve this kind of obsession with looking and commodifying otherness, with commodifying the body rather than thinking about labor or intelligence. If capitalism is always going to involve this kind of staging of beauty pageants and family stories and who plays what character, then what is the point in really trying to make money over and over again? And this is why I think a lot of critical race scholars end up going back to Marx. It is why also I think that German Jewish intellectuals often return to Marx, that capitalism inevitably leads back to this desire to objectify and commodify others, but to also diminish the capacity of other people to compete fairly for one's own interests. So race baiting is a political strategy that is also about trying to seize economic power over city, over country, over territory. It is about trying to imagine that entire sections of the world are incapable of thinking, are incapable of feeling, and are even unworthy of life. And lots of this, I mean, I would argue this is all done because people refuse to accept their class position and refuse to compete fairly and want to occupy the position of the ruling class. Throughout the whole course of someone's life in North America, even throughout the world, there will be this constant desire to be middle class and rich and to do damage to every other person one comes across for their own class interests. So this is why critical race scholars will always often end up going back to Marx, as do many feminist and queer theorists. So that is all for this week. I hope you are doing well. Thank you very much. And we will have a meeting, an optional meeting to discuss the assignments. I have sent you the Zoom link. Thank you. I hope that you are all enjoying the class. Sometimes my tones of voice can be theatrical, which is supposed to be interesting, but I will try to give a straight reading in most of the lectures. Race is a really emotional topic, but ultimately, I think Marxism also does subdue the kind of emotions behind race, because if it was not for the existence of a workplace or money, if we were not competing for jobs or for housing, would there really be would people find the need to talk about race or to divide themselves or to try to form networks of people, even friend circles in certain industries? I don't know. If human relationships, including romantic relationships, were not also about economic maintenance of a partner and a household, would people feel the need to body shame and try to promote certain beauty ideals? I don't know. Ultimately, I think race and the use of the police and the pathologization of people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color is really about capitalist competition. So that is all I have to share with you today. Thank you. Bye bye.